off before saying what?" she finished with a snort. Sylviana saw anything that took time away from her novices and accepted as needless interruption. "I think I remember," Elida told her dully. When Sylviana finally left, after only half an hour by the chimes of Semila's clock, yet an endless eternity, all that kept Elida from calling the hall to sit immediately so she could demand Alviarin be stripped of the keeper's stole was the certainty of her foretelling and the certainty that Ciane would trace that trail of treason back to Alviarin. That and the sure fact that whether or not Alviarin fell in the confrontation, she herself definitely would. So Elida do Avrinia Royhan, Watcher of the Seals, the Flame of Tarvalon, the Amerlin Seat, surely the most powerful ruler in the world, lay face down on her bed and blubbered into her pillows, too tender to don the shift that lay discarded on the floor, certain that when Alviarin returned, the woman would insist on her sitting through the entire interview. She blubbered, and through her tears she prayed for Alviarin's downfall to come soon. "I did not tell you to have Elida beaten," that voice of crystal chimes said. "Do you rise above yourself?" Alviarin flung herself from her knees onto her belly before the woman who seemed made of dark shadows and silvery light. Seizing the hem of Messana's dress, she rained kisses on it. The weave of illusion, it must be that, though she could not see a single thread of Sidar any more than she could sense the ability to channel in the woman who stood over her, did not hold completely, with her frantically shifting the skirt's edge. Flickers of bronze silk with a thin border of intricately embroidered black scrollwork showed through. "I live to serve and obey you, great mistress," Alviarin panted between kisses. "I know that I am among the lowest of the low, a worm in your presence, and I pray only for your smile." She had been punished once for rising above herself. Not for disobedience, thanks be to the great Lord of the Dark, and she knew that whatever howls Elida might be raising right then, they could not be half so loud as her own had been. Messana let the kissing go on for some time, and finally signaled an end by tipping Alviarin's face up with the toe of a slipper beneath the chin. "The decree has gone out." It was not a question, but Alviarin answered hastily. "Yes, great mistress. Copies went to North Harbor and South Harbor even before I had Elida sign. The first couriers have gone, and no merchant will leave the city without copies to distribute." Messana knew all that, of course. She knew everything. A cramp tightened the back of Alviarin's awkwardly craned neck, but she did not move. Messana would tell her when to move. "Great mistress, Elida is an empty husk. With all humility, would it not be better without the need to use her?" She held her breath. Questions could be dangerous with the chosen. A shadow-nailed silvery finger tapped silver lips, pursed in an amused smile. "Better if you wore the Amerlin stole, child," Messana said at last. "An ambition small enough to fit you, but all in its time. For now I have a tiny task for you. In spite of all the walls that have gone up between the Ajas, the heads of the Ajas seem to encounter one another with surprising frequency. By chance, they make it seem. All but the red, at least. A pity Galena got herself killed, or she could tell you what they are about. Very probably it is trivial, but you will learn why they bare teeth at one another in public, then whisper together in private." "I hear and obey, great mistress," Alviarin replied promptly, grateful that Messana considered it unimportant. The great secret of who headed the Ajas was none to her. Every black sister was required to relay to the Supreme Council every whisper inside her supposed Aja, but only Galena among them had been black. That meant querying the black sisters among the sitters, which meant going through all the layers between them and her. That would take time, and without any certainty of success. Except for Feray Neheran and Suana Dragand, who were the heads of their Ajas, sitters rarely seemed to know what their Aja's head was thinking until they were told. "I will tell you as soon as I learn, great mistress." But she did file away a tidbit for herself. Trivial matter or not, Messana did not know everything that happened in the White Tower, and Alviarin would keep her eyes open for a sister in bronze skirts bordered on the hem in black scrollwork. Messana was hiding herself in the tower, and knowledge was power. Chapter 26. The Extra Bit. Ciane strode the hallways of the tower with a growing sense of being confounded at every turn. The White Tower was quite large, true, but she had been at this for hours. She very much wanted to be snug in her own rooms. Despite casements in place in every window, drafts drifted along the broad tapestry-hung corridors and made the stand lamps flicker. Cold drafts, and difficult to ignore when they slipped under her skirts. Her rooms were warm and comfortable and safe. Maids bobbed curtsies and manservants bowed in her wake, half seen and completely ignored. Most sisters were in their own Ajah's quarters, and those few out and about moved with wary pride, often in pairs, always of the same Ajah, shawls spread along their arms and displayed like banners. She smiled and nodded pleasantly to Taline, but the statuesque, golden-haired sitter returned a hard stare, beauty carved from ice, then stalked away, twitching her green-fringed shawl. Too late now to approach Taline about being part of the search, even had Pevara been agreeable. Pevara counseled caution, then more caution, and truth to tell, Ciane was more than willing to listen under the circumstances. It was just that Taline was a friend, had been a friend. Taline was not the worst. Several ordinary sisters sniffed at her openly, at a sitter. None white, of course, but that should have made no difference. No matter what was going on in the tower, proprieties should be observed. Jewelaine Madoma, a tall, attractive woman with short-cut black hair who had held a chair for the Brown less than a year, brushed past her without so much as a murmur of apology, and went off with those mannish strides of hers. Saren Asnobar, another brown sitter, gave Ciane a fierce scowl and fingered that curved knife she always carried behind her belt before disappearing down a side corridor. Saren was Altaran, slight touches of white at her dark temples, emphasizing a thin, age-faded white scar across one olive cheek, and only a warder could match her for scowling. Perhaps these things were all to be expected. There had been several unfortunate incidents recently, and no sister would forget being bundled unceremoniously from the hallways around another Ajah's quarters, much less what had sometimes gone with it. Rumor said a sitter, had had more than her dignity ruffled by the Reds, though not who. A great pity the hall could not obstruct Elida's mad decree, but first one Ajah, then another had leaped on the new prerogatives. Few sitters were willing to think of giving them up, now they were in place, and the result was a tower divided very nearly into armed camps. Once Ciane had thought the air in the tower felt like a quivering hot jelly of suspicion and backbiting. Now it was quivering hot jelly with an acid bite. Clicking her tongue in vexation, she adjusted her own white-fringed shawl as Saren vanished. It was illogical to flinch because an Altaran scowled. Even Saren would go no further, surely not. And more than illogical to worry over what she could not change when she had a task. And then, after all of her search that morning, she took a single step and saw her long-sought quarry walking toward her. Zara Dakan was a slim, black-haired girl with a prideful air, properly self-possessed, and by all outward evidence untouched by the heated currents flowing through the tower these days. Well, not a girl precisely, but Ciane was sure she had not worn that white-fringed shawl 50 years yet. She was inexperienced. Relatively inexperienced. That might help. Zara made no move to avoid a sitter of her own Ajah, bowing her head in respect as Ciane fell in beside her. Quite a lot of intricate golden embroidery climbed the sleeves of her snowy dress and made a wide band at the bottom of her skirt. It was an unusual degree of show for the white Ajah. "Sitter," she murmured. Did her blue eyes hold a touch of worry? "I need you for something," Ciane said more calmly than she felt. Very likely she was transplanting her own feelings into Zara's big eyes. Come with me." There was nothing to fear, not in the heart of the White Tower, but keeping her hands folded at her waist, unclenched, required surprising effort. As expected, as hoped, Zara went along with only another murmur, this of acquiescence. She glided at Siane's side quite gracefully as they descended broad marble staircases and wide curving ramps, and gave only the slightest frown when Siane opened a door onto the ground floor, onto narrow stairs that spiraled down into darkness. "After you, sister," Siane said, channeling a small ball of light. By protocol, she should have preceded the other woman, but she could not bring herself to do that. Zara did not hesitate in going down. Logically, she had nothing to fear from a sitter, a white sitter. Logically, Siane would tell her what she wanted when the time was ripe, and it would be nothing she could not do. Illogically, Siane's stomach fluttered like a huge moth. Light. She held Saidar and the other woman did not. Zara was weaker in any case. There was nothing to fear, which did nothing to quiet those fluttering wings in her middle. Down they climbed and down, past doors letting onto basements and sub-basements, until they reached the very lowest level, below even where the accepted were tested. The dark hallway was lit only by Siane's small light. They held their skirts high, but their slippers kicked up small clouds of dust however carefully they stepped. Plain wooden doors lined the smooth stone walls, many with great lumps of rust for hinges and locks. "Sitter," Zara asked, finally showing doubt, "whatever can we be after down here? I don't believe anyone has been this deep for years." Siane was sure her own visit a few days earlier had been the first to this level in at least a century. That was one of the reasons she and Pevara had chosen it. "Just in here," she said, swinging open a door that moved with only a little squealing. No amount of oil could loosen all the rust, and efforts to use the power had been useless. Her abilities with Earth were better than Pevara's, but that was not saying very much. Zara stepped in and blinked in surprise. In an otherwise empty room, Pevara sat behind a sturdy, if rather worn table with 3 small benches around it. Getting those few pieces down unseen had been difficult, especially when servants could not be trusted. Clearing out the dust had been much simpler, if no more pleasant, and smoothing the dust in the hall outside, necessary after every visit, had been simply onerous. "I was about to give up sitting here in the dark," Pevara growled. The glow of Saidar surrounded her as she lifted a lantern from beneath the table and channeled it alight, casting as much illumination as the rough-walled former storeroom deserved. Somewhat plump and normally pretty, the red sitter looked a bear with 2 sore teeth. "We want to ask you a few questions, Zara," and she shielded the woman as Siane shut the door. Zara's shadowed face remained utterly calm, but she swallowed audibly. "About what, sitters?" There was the faintest tremor in the younger woman's voice as well. It could be simply the mood of the tower, though. "The Black Aja," Pevara replied curtly. "We want to know whether you're a dark friend." Amazement and outrage shattered Zara's calm. Most would have taken that for sufficient denial without her snapped, "I don't have to take that from you. You Reds have been setting up false dragons for years. If you ask me, there's no need to look further than the Red quarters to find Black sisters." Pevara's face darkened with fury. Her loyalty to her Aja was strong, which went without saying, but worse, she had lost her entire family to dark friends. Siane decided to step in before Pevara resorted to brute force. They had no proof. Not yet. "Sit, Zara," she said, with as much warmth as she could muster. "Sit down, sister." Zara turned toward the door as though she might disobey an order from a sitter and of her own Aja. But at last she settled onto one of the benches, stiffly, sitting right at the edge. Before Siane had finished taking a seat that placed Zara between them, Pevara laid the ivory-white oath rod on the battered tabletop. Siane sighed. They were sitters with a perfect right to use any ter'angreal they wished, but she had been the one to filch it. She could not help thinking of it as filching when she had observed none of the proper procedures, and the whole time in the back of her head she had been sure she would to find long dead Sorella Bagan standing here, ready to haul her off to the mistress of novices' study by her ear. Irrational, but no less real. "We want to make sure you tell the truth," Pevara said, still sounding like an angry bear. "So you will swear an oath on this, and then I'll ask again." "I should not be subjected to this," Zara said with an accusing look at Siain. "But I will re-swear all of the oaths, if that's what it needs to satisfy you. And I will demand an apology from you both afterward." She hardly sounded like a woman shielded, and asked such a question. Almost contemptuously she reached for the slim, foot-long rod. It shone in the dim light of the lantern. "You'll swear to obey the two of us absolutely," Pevara told her, and that hand snatched back as if from a coiled viper. Pevara went right on, even sliding the rod closer to the woman with 2 fingers. "That way we can tell you to answer truthfully, and know you will. And if you give the wrong answer, we can know you'll be obedient and helpful in helping us hunt down your black sisters. The rod can be used to free you of the oath, if you give the right answer." "To free?" Zara exclaimed. "I've never heard of anyone being loosed from an oath on the oath rod." "That is why we are taking all these precautions," Siain told her. "Logically, a black sister must be able to lie, which means she must have freed of at least that oath, and likely all 3. Pevara and I tested and found the procedure much the same as taking an oath." She did not mention how painful it had been, though, leaving the pair of them weeping. She also did not mention that Zara would not be freed of her oath, whatever her answer, not until the search for the Black Ajah came to a conclusion. For one thing, she could not be allowed to run off and complain about this questioning, which she most certainly would with every right, if she was not of the Black. If. Light, but Siain wished they had found a sister from another Ajah who fit the criteria they had set. A green or a yellow would have done quite nicely. That lot were overweening at the best of times, and of late, no. She was not going to fall prey to the sickness spreading through the tower. Yet she could not help the names that flashed through her head. 12 greens, twice as many yellows, and every one long past you, taking down a few rungs. Sniff at a sitter? "You freed yourselves from one of the oaths?" Zara sounded startled, disgusted, uneasy, all at the same time. Perfectly reasonable responses. "And took it again," Pevara muttered impatiently. Snatching up the slim rod, she channeled a little spirit into one end, while maintaining Zara's shield. "Under the light, I vow to speak no word that is not true. Under the light, I vow to make no weapon for one man to kill another. Under the light, I vow not to use the one power as a weapon except against shadow spawn, or in the last defense of my life, the life of my warder, or that of another sister." She did not grimace over the part about warders. New sisters bound for the red often did. "I am not a dark friend. I hope that satisfies you." She showed Zara her teeth, but whether in smile or snarl was hard to say. Siain retook the oaths in turn, each producing a slight momentary pressure everywhere from her scalp to the soles of her feet. In truth, the pressure was difficult to detect at all, with her skin still feeling too tight from retaking the oath against speaking a lie. Claiming that Pevara had a beard, or that the streets of Tarvalon were paved with cheese, had been strangely exhilarating for a time. Even Pevara had giggled, but hardly worth the discomfort now. Testing had not really seemed necessary to her. Logically, it must be so. Saying that she was not of the Black twisted her tongue, a vile thing to be forced to deny, but she handed Zara the oath rod with a decisive nod. Shifting on her bench, the slender woman turned the smooth white rod in her fingers, swallowing convulsively. The pale lantern light made her appear ill. She looked from one of them to the other, wide-eyed. Then her hands tightened on the rod, and she nodded. "Exactly as I said," Pevara growled, channeling spirit to the rod again. "Or you'll be swearing until you have it right." "I vow to obey the two of you absolutely," Zara said in a tight voice, then shuddered as the oath took hold. It was always tighter at the first. "Ask me about the Black Ajah," she demanded. Her hands shook, holding the rod. "Ask me about the Black Ajah." Her intensity told Siain the answer even before Pevara released the flow of spirit and asked the question, commanding utter truth. "No!" Zara practically shouted. "No, I am not Black Ajah. Now take this oath from me. Free me!" Siain slumped dejectedly, resting her elbows on the table. She certainly had not wanted Zara to answer yes, but she had been sure they had found the other woman out in a lie. One lie found, or so it had seemed, after weeks of searching. How many more weeks of searching lay ahead, and of looking over her shoulder from waking to sleeping, when she managed to sleep. Pevara stabbed an accusing finger at the woman. "You told people that you came from the north." Zara's eyes went wide again. "I did," she said slowly. "I rode down the bank of the Aranin to Jualda. Now free me of this oath." She licked her lips. Siain frowned at her. "Golden thorn seeds and a red cocklebur were found on your saddlecloth, Zara. Golden thorn and red cocklebur can't be found for 100 miles south of Tarvalon." Zara leaped to her feet, and Pevara snapped, "Sit down!" The woman dropped onto the bench with a loud smack, but she did not even wince. She was trembling, no, shaking. Her mouth was clamped shut, otherwise Siain was sure her teeth would have been chattering. Light, the question of north or south, frightened her more than an accusation of being a dark friend. "From where did you start out?" Siain asked slowly. "And why—" She meant to ask why the woman had gone roundabout, which plainly she had, just to hide which direction she came from, but answers burst from Zara's mouth. "From Saladar," she squealed. There was no other word for it. Still clutching the oath rod, she writhed on her bench. Tears spilled from her eyes, eyes as wide as they would go and fixed on Pevara. Words poured out, though her teeth truly did chatter now. "I came to make sure all the sisters here know about the Reds and Logain, so they'll depose Elida, and the tower can be whole again." With a wail, she collapsed into open-mouthed bawling as she stared at the red sitter. "Well," Pevara said. Then again, more grimly, "Well." Her face was all composure, but the glitter in her dark eyes was far from the mischief Siain remembered as novice and accepted. "So you are the source of that rumor. You are going to stand before the hall and reveal it for the lie it is. Admit the lie, girl." If Zara's eyes had been wide before, they bulged now. The rod dropped from her hands to roll across the tabletop, and she clutched her throat. A choking sound came from her suddenly gaping mouth. Pevara stared at her in shock, but suddenly Siain understood. "Light's mercy," she breathed. "You do not have to lie, Zara." Zara's legs thrashed beneath the table as if she were trying to rise and could not get her feet under her. "Tell her, Pevara. She believes it's true. You've commanded her to speak the truth and to lie. Don't look at me that way. She believes." A bluish tinge appeared on Zara's lips. Her eyelids fluttered. Siain gathered calm with both hands. "Pevara, you gave the order, so apparently you must release her, or she will suffocate right in front of us." "She's a rebel." Pevara's mutter invested that word with all the scorn it could hold. But then she sighed. "She hasn't been tried yet." "You don't have to lie, girl." Zara toppled forward and lay with her cheek pressed against the tabletop, gulping air between whimpers. Siain shook her head in wonder. They had not considered the possibility of conflicting oaths. What if the Black Ajah did not merely remove the oath against lying, but replaced it with one of their own? What if they replaced all three with their own oaths? She and Pevara would need to go very carefully if they did find a Black sister, or they might have her fall dead before they all knew what the conflict was. Perhaps first a renunciation of all oaths, no way to go about it more carefully without knowing what Black Sisters swore, followed by retaking the three? Light. The pain of being loosed from everything at once would be little short of being put to the question. Maybe not short of it at all, but certainly a dark friend deserved that and more, if they ever found one. Pivara glared down at the gasping woman without the slightest touch of pity on her face. When she stands trial for rebellion, I intend to sit on her court. When she is tried, Pivara, Siane said thoughtfully. A pity to lose the assistance of one we know isn't a dark friend. And since she is a rebel, we need not be overly concerned about using her. There had been a number of discussions, none to a conclusion, about the second reason for leaving the new oath in place. A sister sworn to obey could be compelled. Siane shifted uneasily. That sounded entirely too close to the forbidden vileness of compulsion. She could be induced to help in the hunt, so long as you did not mind forcing her to accept the danger, whether she wished to or not. I cannot think they would send only one, she went on. Zara, how many of you came to spread this tale? 10, the woman mumbled against the tabletop, then jerked erect, glaring in defiance. I will not betray my sisters. I won't. Abruptly, she cut off, lips twisting bitterly as she realized she had done just that. Names, Pivara barked. Give me their names, or I will have your hide here and now. Names spilled from Zara's unwilling lips. At the command, certainly, more than the threat. Looking at Pivara's grim face, though, Siane was sure she needed little provocation to strike Zara like a novice caught stealing. Strangely, she herself did not feel the same animosity. Revulsion, yes, but clearly not as strong. The woman was a rebel who had helped break the White Tower when a sister must accept anything to keep the tower whole, and yet very strange. You agree, Pivara? She said when the list concluded. The stubborn woman gave her only a fierce nod for agreement. Very well. Zara, you will bring Bernila to my rooms this afternoon. There were 2 from each Ajah, excepting the blue and the red, it seemed, but best to begin with the other white. You will say only that I wish to speak to her on a private matter. You will give her no warning by word, deed, or omission. Then you will stand quietly and let Pivara and me do what is necessary. You are being recruited into a worthier cause than your misguided rebellion, Zara. Of course it was misguided, no matter how mad with power Elida had become. You are going to help us hunt down the Black Ajah. Zara's head jerked unwilling nods at each injunction, her face pained. But at mention of a hunt for the Black Ajah, she gasped. Lights! Her wits must have been totally unhinged by her experiences not to see that. And you will stop spreading these stories, Pivara put in sternly. From this moment you'll not mention the Red Ajah and false dragons together. Am I understood? Zara's face donned a mask of sullen stubbornness. Zara's mouth said, I understand, sitter. She looked ready to begin weeping again from sheer frustration. Then get out of my sight, Pivara told her, releasing the shield and sidearm together. And compose yourself. Wash your face and straighten your hair. That last was directed at the back of the woman already darting from the table. Zara had to pull her hands away from her hair to open the door. As the door squeaked shut behind her, Pivara snorted. I wouldn't put it past her to have gone to this Bernila like a sloven, hoping to warn her that way. A valid point, Siane admitted. But who will we warn if we scowl right and left at these women? At the very least, we will attract notice. The way matters are, Siane, we wouldn't attract notice kicking them across the tower grounds. Pivara sounded as if that were an attractive notion. They are rebels, and I intend to hold them so hard they squeak if one of them so much as has a wrong thought. They went round and round about that. Siane insisted that care in the orders they gave, leaving no loopholes, would be sufficient. Pivara pointed out that they were letting 10 rebels, 10, walk the tower's halls unpunished. Siane said they would face punishment eventually, and Pivara growled that eventually was not soon enough. Siain had always admired the other woman's strength of will, but really, sometimes it was pure stubbornness. A faint creak from a hinge was all the warning Siain had to snatch the oath rod into her lap, hiding it in folds of her skirt as the door opened wide. She and Pevara embraced the steps almost as one. Saren walked into the room calmly, holding a lantern, and stood aside for Talim, who was followed by tiny Yukiri with a second light, and boyishly slim Dosine, tall for a Kyrianan, who closed the door quite firmly and settled her back against it as if to keep anyone from leaving. 4 sitters representing all the remaining Ajahs in the tower. They seemed to ignore the fact that Siain and Pevara held Saidar. Suddenly, to Siain, the room felt rather crowded. Imagination and irrational, but strange to see the pair of you together, Saren said. Her face might be serene, but she slid fingers along the hilt of that curved knife behind her belt. She'd held her chair 40 years, longer than anyone else in the hall, and everyone had learned to be careful of her temper. We might say the same of you, Pevara replied dryly. Saren's temper never upset her. Or did you come down here to help Dosine try to get some of her own back? A sudden flush made the Yellow's face look even more that of a pretty boy despite her elegant bearing, and told Siain which sitter had strayed too near the red quarters with unfortunate results. I wouldn't have thought that would bring you together, though. Greens at Yellow's throats, browns at Gray's. Or did you just bring them down for a quiet duel, Saren? Frantically, Siain cast around for what reason would have these 4 this deep into the bedrock of Tar Valon. What could tie them together? Their Ajahs, all of the Ajahs, truly were at one another's throats. All 4 had been handed penances by Elida. No sitter could enjoy labor, especially when everyone knew exactly why she was scrubbing floors or pots, yet that was hardly a bond. What else? None were nobly born. Saren and Yukiri were the daughters of innkeepers, Taline of farmers, while Dosine's father had been a cutler. Saren had been trained first by the Daughters of Silence, the only one of that lot to reach the shawl. Absolutely useless drivel. Suddenly something did strike her and dried her throat. Saren, with her temper often barely in rein. Dosine, who had actually run away 3 times as a novice, though she had only once made it as far as the bridges. Taline, who might have earned more punishments than any other novice in the history of the tower. Yukiri, always the last Grey to join her sister's consensus when she wanted to go another way, the last to join the halls, for that matter. All 4 were considered rebels in a way, and Elida had humiliated every one. Could they be thinking they had made a mistake, standing to depose Swan and raise Elida? Could they have found out about Zera and the others? And if so, what did they intend to do? Mentally, Siain prepared herself to weave Saidar, though without much hope that she could escape. Pevara matched Saren and Yukiri in strength, but she herself was weaker than any here, save Dosine. She prepared herself, and Taline stepped forward and burst all of her logical deductions to flinders. Yukiri noticed you 2 sneaking about together, and we want to know why. Her surprisingly deep voice held heat, despite the ice that seemed to coat her face. Did the heads of your Ajahs set you a secret task? In public, the Ajahs' heads snarl at one another worse than anyone else, but they've been sneaking off into corners to talk, it seems. Whatever they're scheming, the hall has a right to know. Oh, do give over, Taline. Yukiri's voice was always an even bigger surprise than Taline's. The woman looked a miniature queen, in dark silver silk with ivory lace, but she sounded a comfortable countrywoman. She claimed the contrast helped in negotiations. She smiled at Siain and Pevara, a monarch perhaps unsure how gracious she should be. I saw the pair of you sniffing about like ferrets at the hen coop, she said, but I held my tongue. You might be pillow friends for all I know, and whose business is that but yours? I held my tongue till Taline here started yelping about who's been huddling in corners. I've seen a bit of huddling in corners myself, and I suspect some of those women might head their Ajahs as well, so sometimes 6 and 6 make a dozen, and sometimes they make a mess. Tell us if you can now. The hall does have a right. We are not leaving until you do tell, Taline put in even more heatedly than before. Pevara snorted and folded her arms. If the head of my Aja spoke 2 words to me, I'd see no reason to tell you what they were. As it happens, what Siane and I were discussing has nothing to do with the red or the white. Snoop elsewhere. But she did not release Sidar. Neither did Siane. Bloody useless, and I bloody knew it, Dosine muttered from her place by the door. Why I ever flaming let you talk me into this? Just as bloody well nobody else knows, or we'd have sheep's wallop all over faces for the whole bloody tower to see. At times she had a tongue like a boy, too, a boy who needed his mouth washed out. Siane would have stood to leave if she had not feared her knees would betray her. Pevara did stand, and raised an impatient eyebrow at the women between her and the door. Saerin fingered her knife hilt and eyed them quizzically, not shifting a step. A puzzle, she murmured. Suddenly she glided forward, her free hand dipping into Siane's lap so quickly that Siane gasped. She tried to keep the oath rod hidden, but the only result was that she ended with Saerin holding the rod waist-high with one hand, while she held the other end and a fistful of her skirts. I enjoy puzzles, Saerin said. Siane let go and adjusted her dress. There seemed nothing else to do. The appearance of the rod produced a momentary babble as nearly everyone spoke at once. Blood and fire, Dosine growled. Are you down here raising new bloody sisters? Oh, leave it with them, Saerin. Yukiri laughed right on top of her. Whatever they're up to, it's their own business. Atop both, Taline barked, Why else are they sneaking about together, if it isn't to do with the Aja heads? Saerin waved a hand and after a moment gained quiet. All present were sitters, but she had the right to speak first in the hall, and her 40 years counted for something, too. This is the key to the puzzle, I think, she said, stroking the rod with her thumb. Why this, after all? Abruptly, the glow of Sidar surrounded her, too, and she channeled spirit to the rod. Under the light I will speak no word that is not true. I am not a dark friend. In the silence that followed, a mouse sneezing would have sounded loud. Am I right? Saerin said, releasing the power. She held the rod out toward Siane. For the 3rd time, Siane retook the oath against lying, and for the 2nd time repeated that she was not of the black. Pevara did the same with frozen dignity, and eyes sharp as an eagle's. This is ridiculous, Taline said. There is no black Aja. Yukiri took the rod from Pevara and channeled. Under the light I will speak no word that is not true. I am not black Aja. The light of Sidar around her winked out, and she handed the rod to Dosine. Taline frowned in disgust. Stand aside, Dosine. I, for one, will not put up with this filthy suggestion. Under the light, I will speak no word that is not true, Dosine said almost reverently, the glow around her like a halo. I am not of the Black Aja. When matters were serious, her tongue was as clean as any mistress of novices could have wished. She extended the rod to Taline. The golden-haired woman started back as from a poisonous snake. Even to ask this is a slander. Worse than slander. Something feral moved in her eyes. An irrational thought, perhaps, but that was what Siane saw. Now move out of my way, Taline demanded, with all the authority of a sitter in her voice. I am leaving. I think not, Pevara said quietly, and Yukiri nodded slowly in agreement. Saerin did not stroke her knife hilt. She gripped it till her knuckles went white. Riding through the deep snows of Andor, floundering through them, Tovanne Ghazal cursed the day she was born. Short and slightly plump, with smooth copper skin and long, glossy, dark hair, she had seemed pretty to many over the years, but none had ever called her beautiful. Certainly none would now. The dark eyes that had once been direct now bored into whatever she looked at. That was when she was not angry. She was angry today. When Tovanne was angry, serpents fled. 4 other Reds rode, floundered at her back, and behind them 20 of the tower guard in dark coats and cloaks. None of the men liked it that their armor was stowed away on the pack horses, and they watched the forest lining both sides of the road as though expecting attack any moment. How they thought to cross 300 miles of Andor unnoticed, wearing coats and cloaks with the flame of Tar Valon shining bright on them, Tovann could not imagine. The journey was almost done, though. In another day, perhaps 2, with roads knee-deep in snow on the horses, she would join with 9 other parties exactly like hers. Not all of the sisters in them were red, unfortunately, but that did not trouble her overmuch. Tovann Ghazal, once a sitter for the Red, would go into the histories as the woman who destroyed this Black Tower. She was sure Elida thought her grateful for the chance, called back from exile and disgrace, given the opportunity for redemption. She sneered, and if a wolf had been looking into the deep hood of her cloak, it might have quailed. What had been done 20 years ago was necessary, and the light burned all those who muttered that the Black Ajah must have been involved. It had been necessary and right, but Tovann Ghazal had been driven from her chair in the hall and forced to howl for mercy under the birch, with the assembled sisters watching, and even novices and accepted witnessing that sitters too lay beneath the law, though they were not told what law. And then she'd been sent to work these last 20 years on the isolated Black Hills farm of Mistress Jara de Wheel, a woman who considered an Aes Sedai serving penance in exile no different from any other hand laboring in sun and snow. Tovann's hands shifted on her reins. She could feel the calluses. Mistress de Wheel, even now she could not think of the woman without the honorific she had demanded. Mistress de Wheel believed in hard work, and discipline as tight as any novice faced. She had no mercy on anyone who tried to shirk the back-breaking labor that she herself shared, and less than none for a woman who sneaked away to comfort herself with a pretty boy. That had been Tovann's life these past 20 years, and Elida had slipped through the cracks uncaught, danced her way to the Amyrlin seat that Tovann had once dreamed of for herself. No, she was not grateful, but she had learned to wait her chance. Abruptly, a tall man in a black coat, dark hair falling to his shoulders, spurred his horse out of the forest into the road ahead of her, spraying snow. "There's no point struggling," he announced firmly, raising a gloved hand. "Surrender peacefully, and no one will be hurt." It was neither his appearance nor his words that made Tovann rein up short, letting the other sisters gather beside her. "Take him," she said calmly. "You had better link. He has me shielded." It seemed one of these Ashaman had come to her. How convenient of him. Abruptly she realized that nothing was happening and took her eyes from the fellow to frown at Jennair. The woman's pale, square face seemed absolutely bloodless. "Tovann," she said unsteadily, "I also am shielded." "I am shielded too," Lamai breathed in disbelief, and the others chimed in, increasingly frantic. All shielded. More men in black coats appeared from among the trees, their horses stepping slowly all around. Tovann stopped counting at 15. The guards muttered angrily, waiting on a sister's command. They knew nothing yet, except that a band of rogues had waylaid them. Tovann clicked her tongue in irritation. These men could not all channel, of course, but apparently every Ashaman who could do so had come against her. She did not panic. Unlike some of the sisters with her, these were not the first men who channeled that she had confronted. The tall man began riding toward her, smiling, apparently thinking they had obeyed his ridiculous order. "At my command," she said quietly, "we will break in every direction. As soon as you are far enough away that the man loses the shield." Men always thought they had to be able to see to hold their weaves, which meant that they did have to. "Turn back and help the guards. Ready yourselves." She raised her voice to a shout. "Guardsmen, fight them!" Roaring, the guardsmen surged forward, waving their swords and no doubt thinking to surround and protect the sisters. Pulling her mare around to the right, Tovann dug in her heels and crouched low over Sparrow's neck, dodging between startled guardsmen, then between 2 very young men in black coats who gaped at her in astonishment. Then she was into the trees, urging more speed, snow spraying wildly, careless of whether the mare broke a leg. She liked the animal, but more than a horse would die today. Behind her, shouts, and one voice roaring through all the cacophony, the tall man's voice. "Take them alive, by order of the Dragon Reborn! Harmonize, Sedai, and you'll answer to me!" By order of the Dragon Reborn. For the first time, Tovanne felt fear, an icicle worming into her middle. The Dragon Reborn. She thrashed Sparrow's neck with the reins. The shield was still on her. Surely there were enough trees between them already to block the cursed men's sight of her. Oh, light! The Dragon Reborn! She grunted as something struck her across the middle. A branch, or there was no branch, snatching her out of the saddle. She hung there watching Sparrow plow off at as much of a gallop as the snow allowed. She hung there,
doing good.
In the middle of the air, arms trapped at her sides,
I'm not
feet
doing too
dangling a pace or more above the ground.
Can't complain.
She swallowed hard. It had to be the male part of the power holding her up. She had never been touched by Saidin before.
How about you?
She could feel the thick band of nothing snug around her middle. She thought she could feel the dark one's taint.
That's about it.
She quivered, fighting down screams. The tall man reined his horse to a halt in front of her, and she floated down to sit sideways in front of his saddle. He did not seem particularly interested in the Aes Sedai he had captured, though. "Ardlin!" he shouted. "Norley! Kajima! One of you bloody young louts, come here now!" He was very tall, with shoulders an axe handle wide. That was how Mistress de Wheel would have put it, just short of his middle years, handsome in a brooding, rugged fashion. Not at all like the pretty boys Tovanne, eager and graceful and so easily controlled. A silver sword decorated the tall collar of his black wool coat on one side, with a peculiar creature in gold and red enamel on the other. He was a man who could channel, and he had her shielded and a prisoner. The shriek that burst from her throat startled even her. She would have held it back if she could, but another leaped out behind it, higher still, and another even higher, another and another. Kicking wildly, she flung herself from side to side, useless against the power. She knew that, but only in a tiny corner of her mind. The rest of her howled at the top of her lungs, howled wordless pleas for rescue from the shadow. Screaming, she struggled like a mad beast. Dimly, she was aware of his horse plunging and dancing as her heels drummed its shoulder. Dimly, she heard the man talking. "Easy, you lump-eared sack of coal. Calm down, sister. I'm not going to... Easy, you spavined mule. Light. My apologies, sister. This is how we learn to do it." And then he kissed her. She had only a heartbeat to realize his lips were touching hers. Then sight vanished and warmth flooded through her. More than warmth. She was melted honey inside, bubbling honey, rushing toward the boil. She was a harp string, vibrating faster and faster, vibrating to invisibility and faster still. She was a thin crystal vase, quivering on the brink of shattering. The harp string broke. The vase shattered. Ah! At first, she did not realize that sound had come from her gaping mouth. For a moment, she could not think coherently. Panting, she stared up at the male face above her, wondering who it belonged to. Yes, the tall man. The man who could... I could have done without the extra bit. He sighed, patting the horse's neck. The animal snorted, but it no longer leaped about. Yet I suppose it is necessary. You're hardly a wife. Be calm. Don't try to escape. Don't attack anyone in a black coat. And don't touch the source unless I give you permission. Now, what's your name? Unless he gave permission? The effrontery of the man. Tovanne Ghazal, she said, and blinked. Now, why had she answered him? There you are, another black-coated man said, splashing his horse through the snow to them. This one would be much more to her liking, if he could not answer the channel at least. She doubted this pink-cheeked lad shaved more than twice in a week. "What, Logain?" the pretty boy exclaimed. "Did you take a second one? The Mahale won't like that. I don't think he likes us taking any. Maybe it won't matter, though. you two being so close and all. Close, Binchova, Logain said wryly. If the Mahail had his way, I'd be hoeing turnips with the new boys. Or buried under the field, he added in a mutter she did not think he meant to be heard. However much he heard, the pretty boy laughed with incredulous disbelief. Tovane barely heard him. She was gazing up at the man looming over her. Logain, the false dragon. But he was dead, stilled and dead, and holding her before his saddle with a casual hand. Why was she not screaming or striking at him? Even her belt knife would do this near. Yet she had no desire at all to reach for the ivory haft. She could, she realized. That band around her middle was gone. She could at least slip down off the horse and try to... She had no desire to do that either. "What did you do to me?" she demanded, calmly. At least she had managed to hold on to that. Turning his horse to ride back to the road, Logain told her what he had done, and she put her head against that wide chest, not caring at all how big he was, and wept. She was going to make Elida pay for this, she vowed. If Logain ever let her, she would. That last was an especially bitter thought. Chapter 27. The Bargain. Seated cross-legged in a heavily gilded, high-backed chair, Min tried to lose herself in the leather-bound copy of Herod Fell's Reason and Unreason lying open on her knee. It was not easy. Though the book itself was mesmerizing, Master Fell's writings always swept her into worlds she thought she had not dreamed of while working in stables. She very much regretted the sweet old man's death. She hoped to find a clue in his books to why he had been killed. Her dark ringlets swung as she shook her head and tried to apply herself. The book was fascinating, but the room was oppressive. Rand's small throne room in the Sun Palace was thick with gilt, from the wide cornices to the tall mirrors on the walls replacing those Rand had smashed, from the 2 rows of chairs like the one she had sat in, to the dais at the head of the rows, and the dragon throne atop the dais. That was a monstrosity, in the style of Tyr as imagined by Kyrianan craftsmen, resting on the backs of a pair of dragons, with 2 more dragons for the arms and others climbing the back, all with large sunstones for eyes, the whole glittering with gilt and red enamel. A huge golden wavy-rayed rising sun set in the polished stone floor only added to the sense of heaviness. At least the fires blazing in 2 great fireplaces, tall enough for her to walk into, gave a pleasing warmth, especially with snow spilling down outside. And these were Rand's rooms. The comfort of that alone outweighed any amount of oppression. An irritating thought. This was Rand's room if he ever deigned to return. A very irritating thought. Being in love with a man seemed to consist largely of a great many irritating admissions to yourself. Shifting in a vain attempt to make the hard chair comfortable, she tried to read, but her eyes kept swinging to the tall doors, each climbed by its own line of gilded rising suns. She hoped to see Rand walk in. She feared to see Soralia or Cadsuane. Unconsciously, she adjusted her pale blue coat, fingering the tiny snowflowers embroidered on the lapels. More twined around the sleeves, and the legs of breeches made as snug as she could manage to wriggle herself into. Not that great a change from what she had always worn. Not really. So far she had avoided dresses, however much embroidery she wore, but she very much feared that Soralia meant to stuff her into a dress if the wise one had to peel her out of what she was wearing with her own hands. The woman knew all about her and Rand. All about. She felt her cheeks heating. Soralia seemed to be trying to decide whether Min Farshaw was a suitable lover for Rand al'Thor. That word made her feel foolishly giddy. She was not a fluff-brained girl. That word made her want to look over her shoulder guiltily for the aunts who had raised her. No, she thought wryly, you're not fluff-brained. Fluff has its wits about it compared to you. Or maybe Soralia wanted to know whether Rand was suitable for Min. It seemed that way at times. The wise ones accepted Min as one of them, or very nearly, but these past weeks Soralia had wrung her out like a laundress's mangle. The leather-faced, white-haired wise one wanted to know every scrap about Min and every shred about Rand. She wanted the dust from the bottoms of his pockets. Twice Min had tried balking at the incessant interrogation, and twice Soralia had produced a switch. That terrible old woman simply bundled her over the side of the nearest table, and afterward told her that maybe that would loosen another scrap in her head. None of the other wise ones gave the slightest commiseration either. Light, the things you had to put up with for a man, and she could not have him for herself alone at that. Cadsuane was a different proposition altogether. The immensely dignified Aes Sedai, as gray-haired as Soralia was white, did not seem to care two figs for Min or Rand either one, but she spent a great deal of time in the Sun Palace. Avoiding her entirely was impossible. She seemed to wander wherever she wanted. And when Cadsuane looked at Min, however briefly, Min could not help seeing a woman who could teach bulls to dance and bears to sing. She kept expecting the woman to point at her and announce that it was time Min Farshaw learned to balance a ball on her nose. Sooner or later, Rand had to face Cadsuane again, and the thought tied Min's stomach in knots. She made herself bend back over her book. One of the doors swung open, and Rand strolled in with the dragon scepter nestled in the crook of his arm. He wore a golden crown, a broad circlet of laurel leaves. That must be this crown of swords everyone was talking about. Snug breeches that showed his legs to advantage, and a gold-worked green silk coat that fit him beautifully. He was beautiful. Marking her place with the note Master Fell had written, saying she was too pretty, she carefully closed the book and carefully set it on the floor beside her chair. Then she folded her arms and waited. Had she been standing, she would have tapped her foot. But she would not have the man thinking she was springing up just because he finally appeared. For a moment he stood smiling at her and tugging his earlobe for some reason. He seemed to be humming. Then abruptly he swung round to frown at the doors. "The maidens out there didn't tell me you were in here. They hardly said a word at all. Like they looked ready to vail at the sight of me." "Maybe they are upset," she said calmly. "Maybe they wondered where you were, the way I did. Maybe they wondered whether you were hurt or sick or cold, the way I did," she thought bitterly. The man looked confused. "I wrote to you," he said slowly, and she sniffed. "Twice. With Ashaman to deliver your letters. You wrote twice, Rand al'Thor, if you call it writing." He staggered as if she had slapped him. No, as if she had kicked him in the belly, and blinked. She took a firm hold on herself and settled against the chair back. Give a man sympathy at the wrong moment, and you never regained the ground lost. A part of her wanted to throw her arms around him, comfort him, bear all his pains, soothe all his hurts. He had so many, and refused to admit a one. She was not going to spring up and rush to him, gushing to know what was wrong or liked. He had to be all right. Something took her gently beneath the elbows and lifted her out of the chair. Blue boots dangling, she floated toward him through the air. The dragon scepter floated away from him. So, he thought he could smile, did he? He thought a pretty smile could turn her around? She opened her mouth to give him a piece of her mind. A very sharp piece. Folding his arms around her, he kissed her. When she could breathe again, she peered up at him through her lashes. "The first time," she swallowed to clear her voice. "First, Jahar Narishma stalked in, trying to stare inside everybody's skull the way he does, and vanished after handing me a scrap of parchment. Let me see. It said, 'I have claimed the crown of Ilion. Trust no one until I return. Rand.' A little short of a proper love letter, I'd say." He kissed her again. This time getting her breath back took longer. This was not going as she had expected at all. On the other hand, it was not going very badly. The second time, Jonan Adley delivered a bit of paper that said, "I will return when I finish here. Trust no one. Rand." Adley walked in on me in my bath, she added, and he wasn't shy about getting an eyeful. Rand always tried to pretend he was not jealous, as if there were a man in the world who was not, but she had noticed his scowls at men who looked at her. And his very considerable ardor was more heated afterward, too. She wondered what this kiss would be like. Maybe she should suggest retiring to the bedchamber? No, she would not be that forward, no matter. Rand set her down, his face suddenly bleak. Adley's dead, he said. Suddenly the crown flew from his head, spinning the length of the room as though hurled. Just when she thought it would crash into the back of the dragon throne, and smash through it, the wide ring of gold stopped short and settled slowly onto the throne's seat. Min's breath caught as she looked up at him. Blood glistened in the dark red curls above his left ear. Pulling a lace-edged handkerchief from her sleeve, she reached for his temple, but he caught her wrist. I killed him, he said quietly. She shivered at the sound of his voice. Quiet, the way the grave was quiet. Perhaps the bedchamber was a very good idea, no matter how forward it was. Making herself smile, and blushing when she realized how easy it was to smile, thinking of that huge bed, she gripped the front of his shirt, preparing to rip shirt and coat from his back right then and there. Someone knocked at the doors. Min's hand sprang away from Rand's shirt. She sprang away too. Who could it be, she wondered irritably. The maidens either announced visitors when Rand was there or simply sent them in. Come, he said loudly, giving her a rueful smile, and she blushed again at that. Dobrain put his head in at the door, then entered and shut the door behind him when he saw them standing together. The Kyrianan lord was a small man, little taller than she, with the front of his head shaved and the rest of his mostly gray hair falling to his shoulders. Stripes of blue and white decorated the front of his nearly black coat to below his waist. Even before gaining Rand's favor, he had been a power in the land. Now he ruled here, at least until Elaine could claim the throne. My Lord Dragon, he murmured, bowing. My Lady Taviran. A joke, Min muttered when Rand quirked an eyebrow at her. Perhaps, Dobrain said, shrugging slightly. Yet half the noble women in the city now wear bright colors in imitation of the Lady Min, breeches that display their legs, and many in coats that do not even cover their... He coughed discreetly, realizing that Min's coat did not cover her hips completely. She thought about telling him he had very pretty legs, even if they were decidedly knobby, then quickly thought better. Rand's jealousy might be a wonderful flame if they were alone, but she did not want him striking out at Dobrain. He was capable of that, she feared. Besides, she thought it really was a slip. Lord Dobrain Taborwin was not the sort to make even slightly rough jokes. So you're changing the world too, Min. Grinning, Rand tapped the tip of her nose with a finger. He tapped her nose, like a child he was amused with. Worse, she felt herself grinning back at him like a fool. In better ways than I am, it appears, he went on, and that momentary boyish grin faded like mist. Is all well in Tyr and Ilion, my Lord Dragon? Dobrain inquired. In Tyr and Ilion all is well, Rand replied grimly. What do you have for me, Dobrain? Sit, man, sit. He motioned toward the rows of chairs and took one for himself. I have acted on all of your letters, Dobrain said, seating himself across from Rand, but there is little good to report, I fear. I'll get us something to drink, Min said in a tight voice. Letters? It was not easy to stalk in heeled boots. She had grown accustomed to them, but the things made you sway, whatever you did. Not easy, yet enough anger made anything possible. She stalked to the small gilded table beneath one of the huge mirrors where a silver pitcher and goblets sat. She busied herself with pouring spiced wine, splashing it out furiously. The servants always brought extra goblets in case she had visitors, though she seldom did except for Soralia or a fool lot of noblewomen. The wine was barely warm, but it was more than hot enough for the likes of that pair. She had received 2 letters, but she would bet Dobrain had had 10, 20. Banging pitcher and goblets about, she listened carefully. What had they been up to behind her back with their dozens of letters? Toram Rioton appears to have vanished, Dobrain said, though rumor at least says he still lives, worse luck. Rumors also say that David Hanlon and Geral Mordeth. Padan Fine, as you call the man, have deserted him. By the way, I have settled Toram's sister, the Lady Ailil, in generous apartments, with servants who are trustworthy. By his tone, he clearly meant trustworthy toward himself. The woman would not be able to change her dress without him knowing. I can understand bringing her here and Lord Bertome and the others, but why High Lord Ramon or High Lady Anayala? It goes without saying, of course, that their servants also are trustworthy. How do you know when a woman wants to kill you? Rand mused. When she knows your name? Dobrain did not sound as if he were joking. Rand tilted his head thoughtfully, then nodded. Nodded? She hoped he was not still hearing voices. Rand gestured as if brushing away the women who wanted to kill him. A dangerous thing, with her about. She did not want to kill him, certainly, but she would not mind seeing Soralia go at him with that switch. Breeches did not give much protection. Wyramon is a fool who makes too many mistakes, Rand told Dobrain, who nodded sober agreement. My mistake was thinking I could use him. He seems happy enough to stay near the Dragon Reborn in any case. What else? Min handed him a goblet, and he smiled at her despite the wine that slopped over his wrist. Maybe he thought it was an accident. Little else and too much, Dobrain began, then jerked back in his chair to avoid spilling wine as Min shoved the second silver goblet at him. She had not liked her brief stint as a tavern maid. My thanks, my Lady Min, he murmured graciously, but he eyed her askance as he took the goblet. She walked calmly back to fetch her own wine, calmly. I fear that Lady Caroline and the High Lord Darlin are in Lady Arlen's palace here in the city, the Cairienan lord went on, under the protection of Cadsuane Sedai. Perhaps protection is not the correct word. I have been refused entry to see them, but I hear that they have attempted to leave the city and been brought back like sacks. In a sack, one story claims. Having met Cadsuane, I can almost believe it. Cadsuane, Rand murmured, and Min felt a chill. He did not sound afraid, precisely, yet he did sound more than uneasy. What do you think I should do about Caroline and Darlin, Min? Settling into a chair 2 away from him, Min jerked at suddenly being included. Ruefully, she stared down at the wine soaking through her best cream silk blouse, and her breeches, too. Caroline will support Elaine for the Sun Throne, she said glumly. For warm wine it seemed very cold, and she doubted the stain would ever come out of the blouse. Not a viewing, but I believe her. She did not glance toward Dobrain, though he nodded sagely. Everyone knew about her viewings now. The only result had been a stream of noblewomen who wanted to know their futures, and right sulky, too, when she said she could not tell them. Most would not have been pleased with the little she had seen. Nothing dire, but not at all the bright wonders that fortune-tellers at the fair forecast. As for Darlin, aside from the fact that he'll marry Caroline after she's wrung him out and hung him up to dry, all I can say is that one day he'll be a king. I saw the crown on his head, a thing with a sword on the front of it, but I don't know what country it belongs to. And, oh yes, he'll die in bed and she will survive him. Dobrain choked on his wine, spluttering and dabbing at his lips with a plain linen handkerchief. Most of those who knew did not believe. Quite satisfied with herself, Min drank the little that remained in her goblet. And then she was choking and gasping, jerking her handkerchief from her sleeve to wipe at her mouth. Light. She would have to give herself the dregs. Rand simply nodded, peering into his goblet. So they will live to trouble me, he murmured. A very soft sound, for words like stone. He was hard as a blade, her sheep-herder. And what do I do about... Abruptly he twisted in his chair toward the doors. One was opening. He had very sharp ears. Min had heard nothing. Neither of the 2 Aes Sedai who entered was Cadsuane, and Min felt her shoulders loosen as she tucked her handkerchief away. While Raphella shut the door, Marana curtsied deeply to Rand, though the Grey Sisters' hazel eyes took in Min and Dobrain and filed them away, and then the round-faced Raphella was spreading her deep blue skirts wide, too. Neither rose until Rand gestured. They glided to him wearing cool serenity as they did their dresses, except that the plump blue sister fingered her shawl briefly, as though to remind herself it was there. Min had seen that gesture before from other sisters who had sworn fealty to Rand. It could not be easy for them. Only the White Tower commanded Aes Sedai, but Rand crooked a finger and they came, pointed and they went. Aes Sedai spoke with kings and queens as equal, perhaps slightly as their betters, yet the wise ones called them apprentices and expected them to obey twice as fast as Rand did. None of that showed on Marana's smooth face. "My Lord Dragon," she said respectfully, "we only just learned that you had returned, and we thought you might be eager to learn how matters went with the Atha Anmier." She merely glanced at Dobrain, but he rose immediately. Kyrianen were used to people wanting to speak in private. "Dobrain can stay," Rand said curtly. Had he hesitated? He did not stand. His eyes like blue ice, he was being the dragon reborn for all he was worth. Men had told him these women were his in truth, that all 5 who had accompanied him to the sea folk ship were his, utterly loyal to their oath and therefore obedient to his will. Yet he seemed to find trusting any Aes Sedai difficult. She understood, but he was going to have to learn how. "As you wish," Marana replied, inclining her head briefly. "Rafella and I have reached a bargain with the sea folk. The bargain, they call it." The difference was clear to the ear. Hands lying still on gray-slashed green skirts, she drew a deep breath. She needed it. "Harina din Togara Two Winds, wave mistress of Clan Shodane, speaking for Nesta din Rias Two Moons, mistress of the ships to the Atha Anmier, and thus binding all the Atha Anmier, has promised such ships as the Dragon Reborn needs to sail when and where he needs them, for whatever purposes he requires." Marana did seem to grow a touch pontifical when there were no wise ones around. The wise ones did not allow it. "In return, Rafella and I, speaking for you, promised that the Dragon Reborn will not change any laws of the Atha Anmier, as he has done among the—" For a moment she faltered. "Forgive me. I am used to delivering agreements exactly as made. The word they used was shorebound, but what they mean is what you have done in Tyr and Cairhien." A question appeared in her eyes and was gone. Perhaps she was wondering whether he had done the same in Ilion. She had expressed relief that he had changed nothing in her native Andor. "I suppose I can live with that," he muttered. "Secondly," Rafella took up, folding plump hands at her waist, "you must give the Atha Anmier land, a square 1 mile on a side, at every city on navigable water that you control now or come to control." She sounded less pompous than her companion, but only just. Nor did she sound entirely pleased with what she was saying. She was Tyran, after all, and few ports held a tighter control on their trade than Tyr. "Within that area, the laws of the Atha Anmier are to hold sway above any others. This agreement must also be made by the rulers of those ports, so that—" It was her turn to falter, and her dark cheeks turned a trifle gray. "So the agreement will survive me," Rand said dryly. He barked a laugh. "I can live with that, too." "Every city on water?" Dobrain exclaimed. "Do they mean here, too?" He leaped to his feet and began pacing, spilling more of his wine than Min had. He did not seem to notice. "A mile square? Under the Light alone knows what peculiar laws. I've traveled on a sea folk ship, and it is peculiar. Bare legs are not in it. And what of the customs duties and docking fees and—" Suddenly he rounded on Rand. He scowled at the Aes Sedai, who paid him no mind, but it was to Rand he spoke, in a tone bordering on roughness. "They will ruin Cairhien in a year, my Lord Dragon. They will ruin any port where you allow them to do this." Men agreed silently, but Rand merely waved a hand and laughed again. "They may think so, but I know something of this, Dobrain. They didn't say who chooses the land, so it doesn't have to be on the water at all. They'll have to buy their food from you and live with your laws when they leave, so they can't be too arrogant. At worst, you can collect your customs when the goods come out of their sanctuary. For the rest, if I can accept it, you can too." There was no laughter in his voice now, and Dobrain bowed his head. Min wondered where he had learned all that. He sounded a king, and one who knew what he was doing. Maybe Elaine had taught him. "Secondly implies more," Rand said to the two Aes Sedai. Marana and Raphela exchanged glances, unconsciously touched skirts and shawls, and then Marana spoke, her voice not at all pompous. In fact, it was much too light. "Thirdly, the Dragon Reborn agrees to keep an ambassador chosen by the Atha Anir with him at all times. Harina Din Tokara has named herself. She will be accompanied by her Windfinder, her Swordmaster, and a retinue." "What?" Rand roared, springing from the chair. Raphela rushed ahead, as though afraid he might cut her off. "And fourthly, the Dragon Reborn agrees to go promptly to a summons from the mistress of the ships, but not more than twice in any 3 consecutive years." She finished, panting a little, trying to make the last sound like extenuation. The dragon's scepter flew from the floor behind Rand, and he snagged it out of the air without looking. His eyes were not ice anymore, they were blue fire. "A sea-folk ambassador clinging to my heels?" he shouted. "Obey summonses?" He shook the carved spearhead at them, the green and white tassel flailing. "There are a people out there who want to conquer all of us and might be able to do it. The Forsaken are out there. The Dark One is waiting. Why didn't you agree I'd caulk their hulls while you were about it?" Normally Min tried to soothe his temper when it flared, but this time she sat forward and glared at the Aes Sedai. She agreed with him fully. They had given away the barn to sell a horse. Raphela actually swayed before that blast, but Marana drew herself up, her own eyes managing a good imitation of brown fire flecked with gold. "You castigate us?" she snapped in tones as frosty as her eyes were hot. She was Aes Sedai as the child Min had seen them, regal above queens, powerful above powers. "You were present in the beginning, ta'veren, and you twisted them as you wanted them. You could have had them all kneeling to you, but you left. They were not pleased to know they had been dancing for a ta'veren. Somewhere they learned to weave shields, and before you were well off their ship, Raphela and I were shielded. So we could not take advantage with the power, they said. More than once, Harina threatened to hang us in the rigging by our toes until we came to our senses, and I, for one, believe she meant it. Feel lucky that you have the ships you want, Rand al'Thor. Harina would have given you a handful. Feel lucky she didn't want your new boots and that ghastly throne of yours as well. Oh, by the by, she formally acknowledged you as the Koramor. May you get a bellyache from it." Min stared at her. Rand and Dobrain stared at her, and the Kyrienen's jaw hung open. Raphela stared, her mouth working soundlessly. For that matter, the fire faded from Marana's eyes, and they slowly grew wider and wider, as if she were just hearing what she had said. The dragon's scepter trembled in Rand's fist. Min had seen his fury swell near to bursting for far less. She prayed for a way to avoid the explosion, and could not see one. "It seems," he said finally, "that the words a ta'veren drags out aren't always the words he wants to hear." He sounded calm. Min was not about to think sane. "You've done well, Marana. I handed you a dog's dinner, but you and Raphela have done well." The two Aes Sedai swayed, and for a moment Min thought they might collapse in puddles on the floor from sheer relief. "At least we managed to keep the details from Cadsuane," Raphela said, smoothing her skirts unsteadily. "There was no way to stop everyone learning we had made some sort of agreement, but we kept that much from her." "Yes," Marana said breathlessly. "She even waylaid us on the way here. It's difficult keeping anything from her, but we did. We didn't think you'd want her to—" She trailed off at the stony look on Rand's face. "Cadsuane again," he said flatly. He frowned at the carved length of spearhead in his hand, then tossed it onto a chair as if he did not trust himself with it. "She's in the Sun Palace, is she? Min, tell the maidens outside to carry a message to Cadsuane. She is to attend the Dragon Reborn in all haste. Rand, I don't think, Min began uneasily, but Rand cut in, not harshly, but quite firmly. Do it, please, Min. This woman is like a wolf eyeing the sheepfold. I intend to find out what she wants. Min took her time getting up and dragged her feet to the doors. She was not the only one to think this a bad idea, or at least to want to be elsewhere when the Dragon Reborn faced Cadsuane Malydrin. Dobrain passed her on the way to the door, making a hasty bow with barely a pause, and even Mirana and Rafaela were out of the room before her, though they made it appear they were not hurrying. Inside the room they did, anyway. When Min put her head into the hallway, the two sisters had caught Dobrain and were scurrying along at little short of a trot. Strangely, the half-dozen maidens who had been outside when Min entered earlier had now grown in number until they lined the corridor as far as she could see in both directions. Tall, hard-faced women in the greys and browns and greys of the Kadinsor, shufa wrapped around their heads with the long black veil hanging down. A good many carried their spears and bull-hide bucklers as if they expected a battle. Some were playing a finger game called knife, paper, stone, and the rest were watching intently. Not so intently that they did not see her, though. When she passed Rand's message, hand talk flashed up and down the rows. Then two lanky maidens went trotting off. The others promptly returned to the game, playing or watching. Scratching her head in puzzlement, Min went back in. The maidens often made her nervous, yet they always had a word for her, sometimes respectful, as to a wise one, sometimes joking, though their humor was odd, to say the least. Never had they ignored her like this. Rand was in the bedchamber. That simple fact set her heart racing. He had his coat off, his snowy shirt unlaced at neck and cuffs and pulled out of his breeches. Sitting on the foot of the bed, she leaned back against one of the heavy blackwood bedposts and swung her feet up, crossing her ankles. She had not had a chance to watch Rand undress himself, and she intended to enjoy it. Instead of continuing, though, he stood there looking at her. "What can Cadsuane possibly teach me?" he asked suddenly. "You and all the Ashaman," she replied. That had been her viewing. "I don't know what, Rand. I only know you have to learn it. All of you do." It did not seem he intended to progress beyond letting his shirt hang down. Sighing, she went on. "You need her, Rand. You can't afford to make her angry. You can't afford to chase her away." Actually, she did not think 50 Murdrals and 1,000 Trollocs could chase Cadsuane anywhere, but the point was the same. A far-off look came into Rand's eyes, and after a moment he shook his head. "Why should I listen to a madman?" he muttered almost under his breath. Light! Did he really believe Luz Theron Telamon spoke in his head? Let someone know you need them, Min, and they have a hold on you. A leash to pull you where they want. I won't put a halter on my own neck for any Aes Sedai. Not for anyone. Slowly his fists unclenched. "You I need, Min," he said simply. "Not for your viewings. I just need you." Burn her! But the man could sweep her feet out from under her with a few words. With a smile as eager as hers, he grasped the bottom of his shirt with both hands and bent to begin hauling it over his head. Lacing her fingers over her stomach, she settled back to watch. The three maidens who marched into the room no longer wore the shufa that had concealed their short hair in the corridor. They were empty-handed, and no longer wore those heavy-blade belt knives either. That was all Min had time to notice. Rand's head and arms were still inside the shirt, and Somara, flaxen-haired and tall even for an Aiel woman, seized the white linen and tangled it, trapping him. Almost in the same movement, she kicked him between the legs. With a strangled groan, he bent further, staggering. Nasser, fiery-haired and beautiful despite white scars on both sun-dark cheeks, planted a fist in his right side, hard enough to make him stumble sideways. With a cry, Min launched herself from the bed. She did not know what madness was happening here and could not even begin to guess. One of her knives came smoothly from each sleeve, and she threw herself at the maidens, shouting, "Help! Oh, Rand! Somebody help!" At least that was what she tried to shout. The third maiden, Nandera, turned like a snake, and Min found a foot planted in her stomach. Breath rushed out of her in a wheeze. Her knives flew from numb hands, and she turned a somersault over the graying maiden's foot, landing on her back with a crash that drove out what little air remained in her. Trying to move, trying to breathe, trying to understand, all she could do was lie there and watch. The three women were quite thorough. Nasser and Nandera pounded Rand with their fists, while Somara held him bent over and caught in his own shirt. Again and again and again they drove studied blows into Rand's hard belly, into his right side. Min would have laughed hysterically had she had any breath. They were trying to beat him to death, and they very carefully avoided hitting anywhere near the tender round scar in his left side, with the half-healed slash running through it. She knew very well how hard Rand's body was, how strong, but no one could stand up to that. Slowly his knees folded, and when they thumped to the floor tiles, Nandera and Nasser stood back. Each nodded, and Somara released her hold on Rand's shirt. He fell forward on his face. She could hear him gasping, fighting groans that bubbled up despite his efforts. Kneeling, Somara pulled his shirt down almost tenderly. He lay there with his cheek on the floor, eyes bulging, struggling for breath. Nasser bent to catch a fistful of his hair and jerk his head up. "We won the right for this," she growled. "But every maiden wanted to lay her hands on you. I left my clan for you, Rand al'Thor. I will not have you spit on me." Somara moved a hand as if to smooth hair out of his face, then snatched it back. "This is how we treat a first brother who dishonors us, Rand al'Thor," she said firmly. "The first time. The next, we will use straps." Nandera stood over Rand with fist planted on her hips and a face of stone. "You carry the honor of Far Darai's Mai, son of a maiden," she said grimly. "You promised to call us to dance the spears for you, and then you ran to battle and left us behind. You will not do this again." She stepped over him to stride out, and the other two followed. Only Somara glanced back, and as sympathy touched her blue eyes, there was none in her voice when she said, "Do not make this necessary again, son of a maiden." Rand had pushed himself up to hands and knees by the time Min managed to crawl to him. "They must be mad," she croaked. Light, but her middle hurt. "Ruark will—" She did not know what Ruark would do. Not enough, whatever it was. Soralia would stake them out in the sun, to start. "When we tell her—" "We tell no one," he said. He almost sounded as if he had his breath back, although he was still slightly pop-eyed. How could he do that? "They have the right. They've earned the right." Min recognized that tone much too well. When a man decided to be stubborn, he would sit bare in a nettle patch and deny to your face that they made his bottom sting. She was almost pleased to hear him groan as she helped him to his feet. Well, as they helped each other. If he was going to be a pure wool-headed idiot, he deserved a few bruises. He eased himself onto the bed, lying back on the heaped pillows, and she snuggled in beside him. Not what she'd been hoping for, but as much as was going to happen, she was sure. "Not what I was hoping to use this bed for," he muttered. She was not sure she had been supposed to hear. She laughed. "I enjoy your holding me just as much as the other." Strangely, he smiled at her as if he knew she was lying. Her Aunt Mirren claimed that was one of the 3 lies any man would believe from a woman. "If I am interrupting," a woman's cool voice said from the doorway, "I suppose I could return when it is more convenient." Min jerked away from Rand as though burned, but when he pulled her back, she settled against him again. She recognized the Aes Sedai standing in the doorway, a plump little Kyrianan with 4 thin stripes of color across her full bosom and white slashes in her dark skirts. Daigyan Mosanailan was one of the sisters who had come with Cadsuane, and she was almost as overbearing as Cadsuane herself, in Min's opinion. "Who might you be when you're at home?" Rand said lazily. Whoever you are, didn't anyone ever teach you to knock? Min realized that every muscle in the arm holding her was hard as a rock, though. The moonstone dangling onto Daigyan's forehead on a thin silver chain swung as she slowly shook her head. Plainly, she was not pleased. Cadsuane Sedai received your request, she said even more coolly than before, and asked me to convey her regrets. She very much wishes to finish the piece of needlepoint she is working on. Perhaps she might be able to see you another day, if she can find time. Is that what she said? Rand asked dangerously. Daigyan sniffed disdainfully. I will leave you to resume whatever you were doing. Min wondered whether she could get away with slapping an Aes Sedai. Daigyan eyed her frostily as if hearing the thought, and turned to glide from the room. Rand sat up with a muffled oath. You tell Cadsuane she can go to the pit of doom, he shouted after the retreating sister. Tell her she can rot. It won't do, Rand, Min sighed. This was going to be harder than she had thought. You need Cadsuane. She doesn't need you. He said softly, and she shivered. She had only thought his voice was dangerous before.
Rand prepared carefully, dressing in the green coat again, sending Min with messages for the maidens to carry. At least they would still do that. His ribs ached almost as much on his right side as the wounds did on his left, and his belly felt as if he had been beaten with a board. He had promised them. He seized hold of Saidin, alone in his bedchamber, unwilling to let even Min see him falter again. He could keep her safe at least, somehow, but how could she feel safe if she saw him about to fall over? He had to be strong for her sake. He had to be strong for the world. That bundle of emotions in the back of his head that was Alana reminded him of the cost of carelessness. Right then, Alana was sulking. She must have pushed a wise one too far, because if she was sitting gingerly. I still think this is lunacy, Randolph Thor, Min said as he placed the crown of swords carefully on his head. He did not want those tiny blades to draw blood again now. Are you listening to me? Well, if you intend to go through with it, I'm going with you. You admitted you need me, and you'll need me more than ever for this. She was in full fig, fists on her hips, foot tapping, eyes all but glowing. You're staying here, he told her firmly. He was still not sure what he intended to do, not fully, and he did not want her to see him stumble. He was very afraid he might stumble. He expected an argument, though. She frowned at him, and her foot stopped tapping. The angry light in her eyes faded into worry that vanished in a twinkling. Well, I suppose you're old enough to cross the stable yard without your hand-held, sheep herder. Besides, I am falling behind in my reading. Dropping into one of the tall gilded chairs, she folded her legs beneath her and picked up the book she had been reading when he came in. In moments, she seemed totally engrossed in the page before her. Rand nodded. That was what he wanted. Her here and safe. Still, she did not have to forget him so completely. There were 6 maidens squatting in the hallway outside his door. They stared at him flat-eyed, not speaking. Nandera's gaze the flattest of all. Though Samara and Nasser came close. He thought Nasser was Shido. He would have to keep a hard eye on her. The Ashaman were waiting too. Lews Therin muttered darkly of killing in Rand's head. All but Narishma, with the dragon on their collars as well as the sword. Curtly, he ordered Narishma to stand guard in his apartments, and the man saluted sharply, those dark, too big eyes seeing too much, faintly accusing. Rand did not think the maidens would take out their displeasure on Min, but he was not taking any chances. Lighty had told Narishma everything about the traps he had woven in the stone when he sent the man to fetch Kalimdor. The man was imagining things. Burn him, that had been a mad risk to take. Only madmen never trust. Lews Therin sounded amused, and quite mad. The wounds in Rand's side throbbed. They seemed to resonate with each other in distant pain. Show me where to find Cadsuane, he commanded. Nandera rose smoothly to her feet and started off without a backward glance. He followed, and the others fell in behind him, Deshiva and Flynn, Moore and Hopwell. He gave them hasty instructions as they walked. Flynn, of all people, tried to protest, but Rand bore him down. There was no time for quailing. The grizzled one-time guardsman was the last Rand had expected it of. Moore or Hopwell, perhaps. If no longer exactly dewy-eyed, they were still young enough to leave their razors dry as many days as wet. But not Flynn. Nandera's soft boots made no sound. Their footsteps reverberated from the high, square-vaulted ceiling, chasing away everyone with the shadow of a reason for fear. His wounds pulsed. Every last person in the Sun Palace knew the Dragon Reborn on sight by now, and they knew who the black-coated men were, too. Black-liveried servants made deep bows or curtsies and hurried to get out of his sight. Most nobles were almost as quick to put distance between themselves and 5 men who could channel, going somewhere with purpose on their faces. Ailil watched them pass with an unreadable expression. Anila simpered, of course, but when Rand glanced back, she was staring after him with a face to match Nandera's. Bertome smiled as he made his leg, a dark smile, with neither mirth nor pleasure in it. Nandera did not speak even when they reached their destination, merely pointed to a closed door with one of her spears, turned on her heel, and strode back the way they had come. The Kara Karn, without a single maiden to guard him. Did they think 4 Ashaman enough to keep him safe? Or was her departure another sign of displeasure? "Do what I told you," Rand said. Deshiva gave a jerk as if coming back to himself, then seized the source. The wide door, carved in vertical lines, swung open with a bang on a flow of air. The other 3 took hold of Saidin and followed Deshiva in, faces grim. "The Dragon Reborn," Deshiva's voice sounded loud, magnified slightly by the power. "The King of Ilion, the Lord of the Morning, comes to see the woman Cadsuane Malydrin." Rand stepped in, standing tall. He did not recognize the other weave Deshiva had created, but the air seemed to hum with menace, a sense of something inexorable approaching, drawing ever nearer. "I sent for you, Cadsuane," Rand said. He did not use weaves. His voice was hard and flat enough without aid. The green sister he remembered sat beside a small table with an embroidery hoop in her hands, an opened basket on the polished tabletop spilling out skeins of bright thread from some of its many compartments. She was exactly as he remembered. That strong face, topped by an iron-gray bun decorated with small dangling golden fish and birds, stars and moons. Those dark eyes, seeming almost black in her fair face. Cool, considering eyes. Luce Theron gave a wail and fled at the sight of her. "Well," she said, setting the embroidery hoop on the table, "I must say I've seen better without paying. With all I've been hearing about you, boy, the least I expected was peals of thunder, trumpets in the heavens, flashing lights in the sky." Calmly, she regarded the 5 stone-faced men who could channel, which should have been enough to make any Aes Sedai flinch. Calmly, she regarded the Dragon Reborn. "I hope one of you is at least going to juggle," she said, "or eat fire. I've always enjoyed watching Gleeman eat fire." Flynn barked a laugh before catching himself, and even then raked a hand through his fringe of hair and seemed to be struggling with amusement. Moore and Hopwell exchanged looks, both puzzled and more than a little outraged. Deshiva smiled unpleasantly, and the weave he was holding grew stronger until Rand felt as if he wanted to look over his shoulder to see what was rushing toward him. "It is enough that you know I am who I am," Rand told her. "Deshiva, all of you, wait outside." Deshiva opened his mouth as if to protest. That had not been part of Rand's instructions, but they were not going to overawe the woman, not this way. The man went, though, muttering to himself. Hopwell and Moore actually stepped out eagerly, with sidelong glances at Cadsuane. Flynn was the only one to make a dignified withdrawal, in spite of his limp. And he still seemed amused. Rand channeled, and a heavy, leopard-carved chair floated into the air from its place by the wall spinning end over end in somersaults before settling like a feather in front of Cadsuane. At the same time, a heavy silver pitcher drifted up from a long draped table across the room, making a loud ping as it was suddenly heated. Steam gushed from the top, and it tipped over, whirling round and round like a slow top, as a silver cup darted up to neatly catch the dark pouring. "Too hot, I think," Rand said, and the glassed casements leaped from the tall, narrow windows. Snowflakes billowed in on an icy blast, and the cup soared out through one of the windows, soared back again, straight to his hand as he sat himself. Let her see how calm she could stay with a madman staring at her. The dark liquid was tea, too strong after his boiling, and bitter enough to set his teeth on edge. But the warmth was just right. His skin pebbled in the gusts, howling into the room and flapping tapestries against the walls. But in the void, that was far away, someone else's skin. "The laurel crown is prettier than some," Cadsuane said with a faint smile. Her hair ornaments swayed whenever the wind rose, and small wisps flailed about her bun, but the only notice she took was to catch her embroidery hoop just before it was blown from the table. "I prefer that name, but you can't expect me to be impressed by crowns. I've paddled the bottoms of 2 reigning kings and 3 queens. Not sitting rulers, you understand, once I was done with them. Not for a day or so, but it did get their attention. You can see why crowns don't impress me, though." Rand eased his jaw. Grinding his teeth would not help. He widened his eyes, hoping he looked insane instead of simply furious. "Most Aes Sedai avoid the Sun Palace," he told her, "except for those who have sworn fealty to me, and those I hold prisoner." Right. What was he to do with those? As long as the wise ones kept them out of his hair, all was well enough. "The Aiel seem to think I should come and go as I please," she said absently, eyeing the hoop in her hand as if thinking of taking up her needle again. "A matter of some trifling help I gave some boy or other, though why anyone but his mother should think him worth it, I can hardly say." Rand made another effort not to grind his teeth. The woman had saved his life. Her and Damer Flynn between them, and plenty of others in the bargain, Min among them. But he still owed Cadsuane something for that. Burn her. "I want you to be my advisor. I'm king of Ilion now, and kings have Aes Sedai advisors." She gave his crown a dismissive glance. "Certainly not. An advisor has to stand and watch her charge make a muddle much too often to suit me. She also has to take orders, something I am particularly bad at. Won't someone else do? Alana, perhaps?" Despite herself, Rand sat up straight. Did she know about the bond? Marana had said it was hard to keep anything from her. No. He could worry later about how much his faithful Aes Sedai were telling Cadsuane. Light, he wished Min could be wrong for once, but he would believe himself breathing water first. He could not make himself tell her that he needed her. No halter. "What if you didn't have to swear any oaths?" "I suppose that might work," she said doubtfully, peering at her cursed stitchery. Her eyes rose to his, considering. "You sound uneasy." "I don't like to tell a man he's afraid, even when he has reason to be." "Uneasy over a sister you haven't turned into a tame lapdog, snaring you in some fashion?" "Let me see. I can make you a few promises. Perhaps they will set your mind at rest. I expect you to listen, of course. Make me waste my breath, and you'll yelp for it. But I won't make you do what I want. I won't tolerate anyone lying to me, certainly. That's another thing you'll find decidedly uncomfortable. But I don't expect you to tell me the deepest yearnings of your heart, either. Oh yes, whatever I do, it will be for your own good. Not mine, not the good of the White Tower. Yours. Now, Does that ease your fears? Pardon me, your unease. Wondering whether he was supposed to laugh, Rand stared at her. Do they teach you how to do that? He demanded. Make a promise sound a threat, I mean. Oh, I see. You want rules. Most boys do, whatever they say. Very well. Let me see. I cannot abide incivility, so you will be properly civil to me, to my friends, and my guests. That includes not channeling at them, in case you haven't guessed, and holding your temper, which I understand is memorable. It also takes in your companions in those black coats. A pity if I had to spank you for something one of them did. Does that suffice? I can make more if you need them. Rand set his cup down beside the chair. The tea had gone cold as well as bitter. Snow was beginning to pile up in drifts beneath the windows. I'm the one who's supposed to go mad, Aes Sedai, but you already are. Rising, he strode for the door. I do hope you haven't tried to use Kalendor, she said complacently behind him. I've heard it's vanished from the stone. You managed to escape once, but you might not twice. He stopped short, looking over his shoulder. The woman was pushing that bloody needle through the cloth stretched on her hoop. The wind gusted, swirling snow around her, and she did not even lift her head. What do you mean, escape? What? She did not look up. Oh, very few even in the tower knew what Kalendor is before you drew it. But there are surprising things hidden in musty corners of the tower library. I went rummaging some years ago when I first had the suspicion you might be suckling at your mother's breast. Just before I decided to go back into retirement. Babes are messy things, and I could not see how to find you before you stopped dripping at one end or the other. What do you mean? He demanded roughly. Cadsuane looked up then, and with her hair flung about and snow settling on her dress, she looked a queen. I told you, I cannot abide incivility. If you ask for my help again, I expect you to ask politely. And I will expect an apology for your behavior today. What do you mean about Kalendor? It is flawed, she replied curtly, lacking the buffer that makes other sangreal safe to use. And it apparently magnifies the taint, inducing wildness of the mind, so long as a man is using it anyway. The only safe way for you to use the sword that is not a sword, the only way to use it without the risk of killing yourself or trying to do the light alone knows what insanity, is linked with two women, and one of them guiding the flows. Trying not to hunch his shoulders, he strode away from her. So it had not just been the wildness of saidin around Abu Dar that had killed Adley. He had murdered the man the moment he sent Narishma for the thing. Cadsuane's voice pursued him. Remember, boy, you must ask very nicely and apologize. I might even agree, if your apology sounds truly sincere. Rand barely heard her. He had hoped to use Kalendor again, hoped it would be strong enough. Now, only one chance remained, and it terrified him. He seemed to hear another woman's voice, a dead woman's voice. You could challenge the Creator.
Chapter 28. Crimson Thorn. It hardly seemed the setting for the explosion Elaine feared. Harlan Bridge was a village of moderate size, with 3 inns and enough houses that no one had to sleep in a hayloft. When Elaine and Brigitte went downstairs to the common room that morning, Mistress Dill, the round innkeeper, smiled warmly and offered as much of a curtsy as her size allowed. It was not just that Elaine was Aes Sedai. Mistress Dill was so pleased that her inn was full, what with the roads snow-packed, that she bobbed at nearly everyone. At their entrance, Avienda hastily gulped the last of her breakfast bread and cheese, brushed a few crumbs from her green dress, and snatched up her dark cloak to join them. Outside, the sun was just peeking over the horizon, a low dome of pale yellow. Only a few clouds marred a beautiful blue sky, and they were white and fluffy, not the sort to carry snow. It seemed a wonderful day for traveling. Except that Adelius was trampling a path up the snowy street, and the white-haired sister was dragging one of the kin, Garinia Rosuinda, by her arm. Garinia was a slim-hipped Saldaean who had spent the last 20 years as a merchant, although she looked only a few years older than Nynaeve did. Normally, her strongly hooked nose gave her a forceful appearance, a woman who would make hard trading and not back away. Now her dark tilted eyes were large in her face, and her wide mouth hung open, emitting a wordless wail. A growing knot of kinswomen followed behind, skirts held high out of the snow, whispering among themselves, with more running from every direction to join. Rihanna and the rest of the knitting circle were in the front, all grim-faced except for Kirstian, who seemed even paler than usual. Elise was there too, wearing an utterly blank expression. Adelius stopped in front of Elaine and shoved Garinia so hard the woman fell to hands and knees in the snow, where she stayed, still wailing. The kinswomen gathered behind her, more of their number flocking in. "I'm bringing this to you because Nynaeve is busy," the brown sister told Elaine. She meant that Nynaeve was enjoying a little time alone with Lan somewhere, but for once not so much as a hint of a smile crossed her lips. "Be quiet, child," she snapped at Garinia, who promptly went silent. Adelius gave a satisfied nod. "This is not Garinia Rosuinda," she said. "I finally recognized her. Zarya Alcesa, a novice who ran away just before Van Deen and I decided to retire and write our history of the world. She admitted it when I confronted her. I'm surprised Cariana didn't recognize her before this. They were novices together for 2 years. The law is clear, Elaine. A runaway must be put back in white as soon as possible and kept under strict discipline until she can be returned to the tower for proper punishment. She won't think of running again after that." Elaine nodded slowly, trying to think of what to say. Whether or not Zarya thought of running again, she would not be allowed the opportunity. She was very strong in the power. The tower would not let her go if it took the rest of her life to earn the shawl. But Elaine was recalling something she had heard this woman say the first time she met her. The meaning had not registered then, but now it did. How would Zarya face novice white again after living as her own woman for 70 years? Worse, those whispers among the kinswomen had begun to sound like rumbles. She did not have long to think. Suddenly, Kirstian fell to her knees, clutching at Adelius's skirts with one hand. "I submit myself," she said calmly, her tone a wonder coming from that bloodless face. "I was enrolled in the novice book almost 300 years ago, and ran away less than a year later. I submit myself and beg mercy." It was white-haired Adelius's turn to go wide-eyed. Kirstian was claiming to have run away from the White Tower when she herself was an infant, if not before she was born. Most of the sisters still did not really believe the ages claimed by the kin. Indeed, Kirstian appeared just into her middle years. Even so, Adelius recovered herself quickly. However old the other woman was, Adelius had been Aes Sedai about as long as anyone living. She carried an aura of age and authority. "If that is so, child," her voice did falter just a bit at that, "I fear we must put you in white too. You will still be punished, but surrendering as you have will gain you some mitigation." "That is why I did it." Kirstian's steady tone was spoiled somewhat by a hard swallow. She was almost as strong as Zarya. None of the knitting circle were weak, and she would be held very closely. "I knew you would find me out, sooner or later." Adelius nodded as though that were clearly obvious, though how the woman would have been found out, Elaine could not guess. She very much doubted that Kirstian Chalwyn was the name the woman had been born with. Most of the kin believed in Aes Sedai omniscience, though. They had, at least. Rubbish! Sarenya Vostovan's husky voice cut through the murmured babble of the kin. Neither strong enough to become Aes Sedai, nor nearly old enough to stand very high among the kin, she still stepped from the pack defiantly. Why should we give them up to the White Tower? We have helped women run away, and rightly so. It is not part of the rules to give them back. Control yourself, Rihanna said sharply. Alice, take Sarenya in hand, please. It seems she forgets too many of the rules she claims to know. Alice looked at Rihanna, her face still unreadable. Alice, who enforced the kin's rules with a firm hand. It is not part of our rules to hand runaways back, Rihanna, she said. Rihanna jerked as though struck. And how do you suggest keeping them? She demanded finally. We have always held runaways apart until we were sure they were no longer hunted, and if they were found before, we let the sisters take them. That is the rule, Alice. What other rule do you propose violating? Do you suggest that we actually set ourselves against Aes Sedai? Ridicule of such a notion larded her voice, yet Alice stood looking at her, silent. Yes, a voice shouted from the crowd of kinswomen. We are many, and they are few. Adelius stared at the crowd in disbelief. Elaine embraced Sidar, though she knew the voice was right. The kin were too many. She felt Avienda embracing the power, and Birgitta setting herself. Giving herself a shake as if coming to, Alice did something far more practical, certainly far more effective. Sarenya, she said loudly, you will report to me when we stop tonight with a switch you cut yourself before we leave this morning. You too, Asra. I recognize your voice. And then, just as loudly, she said to Rihanna, I will report myself for your judgment when we stop tonight. I don't see anyone getting ready. The kinswomen broke up quickly then, heading off to gather their things, yet Elaine saw some of them talking fast as they went. When they rode over the bridge across the frozen stream that wound down beside the village, with Nynaeve incredulous over what she had missed, and glaring about for someone to call down, Sarenya and Asra carried switches, as did Alice, and Zarya and Kirstian wore hastily found white dresses beneath their dark cloaks. The Windfinders pointed at them and laughed uproariously. But many of the kinswomen still talked in clusters, falling silent whenever a sister or one of the knitting circle looked at them. And there was a darkness to their eyes when they looked at Aes Sedai. 8 more days of floundering through the snow when it was not falling, and grinding her teeth in an inn when it was. 8 more days of brooding by the kin, of staring bleakly at the sisters, days of strutting by the Windfinders around kin and Aes Sedai alike. On the morning of the 9th day, Elaine began to wish everyone had simply gone for everyone else's throat. She was just wondering whether they could cover the last 10 miles to Camelin without a murder, when Kirstian rapped at her door and darted in without waiting for an answer. The woman's plain woolen dress was not the shade of white proper for a novice, and she had regained much of her dignity somehow, as if knowing her future had smoothed her present. But now she made a hasty curtsy, almost tripping over her cloak, and her nearly black eyes were anxious. Nynaeve Sedai, Elaine Sedai, Lord Land says you are to come at once, she said breathlessly. He told me to speak to no one, and you aren't to either. Elaine and Nynaeve exchanged looks with Avienda and Birgitta. Nynaeve growled something under her breath about the man not knowing private from public, but it was clear before she blushed that she did not believe it. Elaine felt Birgitta focus, the drawn arrow hunting a target. Kirstian did not know what Lan wanted, only where she was to meet them, the small hut outside of Cullen's Crossing where Adelius had taken Ispan the night before. Lan stood outside, his eyes as cold as the air, and would not let Kirstian enter. When Elaine went inside, she saw why. Adelius lay on her side beside an overturned stool, a cup on the rough wooden floor not far from one outstretched hand. Her eyes stared, and a pool of congealed blood spread out from the deep slash across her throat. Ispan lay on a small cot, staring at the ceiling. Lips drawn back in a rictus bared her teeth, and her bulging eyes seemed full of horror. As well they might have, since a wrist-thick wooden stake stood out from between her breasts. The hammer that had plainly been used to drive it in lay beside the cot, on the edge of a dark stain that ran back under the cot. Elaine forced herself to stop thinking about emptying her stomach on the spot. Light, she breathed. Light. Who could do this? How could anyone do this? Avienda shook her head wonderingly, and Lan did not even bother with that. He just watched 9 directions at once, as though he expected whoever or whatever had committed this murder to come through one of the 2 tiny windows, if not through the walls. Birgitta drew her belt knife, and by her face she dearly wished she had her bow. That drawn arrow was stronger than ever in Elaine's head. At first, Nynaeve simply stood in one spot, studying the hut's interior. There was little to see, aside from the obvious. A second 3-legged stool, a rough table holding a flickering lamp, a green teapot and a second cup, a rude stone fireplace with cold ash on the hearthstone. That was all. The hut was so small it only took Nynaeve a step to reach the table. Dipping her finger into the teapot, she touched it to the tip of her tongue, then spat vigorously and emptied the whole teapot onto the table in a wash of tea and tea leaves. Elaine blinked wonderingly. "What happened?" Van Deen asked coolly from the door. Lan moved to bar her way, but she stopped him with a small gesture. Elaine started to put an arm around her and received another raised hand to keep her back. Van Deen's eyes remained on her sister, calm in a face of Aes Sedai serenity. The dead woman on the cot might as well not have existed. "When I saw all of you heading this way, I thought... We knew we didn't have many years remaining, but..." Her voice sounded serenity itself, but small wonder if that was a mask. "What have you found, Nynaeve?" Sympathy looked odd on Nynaeve's face. Clearing her throat, she pointed to the tea leaves without touching them, to white shavings among the matted black leaves. "This is crimson thorn root," she said, trying to sound matter-of-fact and failing. "It's sweet, so you might miss it in tea unless you know what it is, especially if you take a lot of honey." Van Deen nodded, never taking her eyes from her sister. "Adelius developed a taste for sweet tea in Ebudar." "A little kills pain," Nynaeve said. This much kills, but slowly. Even a few sips would be enough." Taking a deep breath, she added, "They might have remained conscious for hours, not able to move, but aware. Either whoever did this didn't want to risk someone coming too soon with an antidote, not that I know one for a brew this strong, or else they wanted one or the other to know who was killing them." Elaine gasped at the brutality, but Van Deen simply nodded. "Ispan, I think, since they appear to have taken the most time with her." The white-haired green almost seemed to be thinking aloud, working out a puzzle. Cutting a throat took less time than driving a stake through someone's heart. The calm of her made Elaine's skin crawl. "Adelius would never have accepted anything to drink from someone she didn't know, not out here with Ispan. Those 2 facts name her killer in a way. A dark friend, and one of our party. One of us." Elaine felt 2 chills, her own and Birgitta's. "One of us," Nynaeve agreed sadly. Avienda began testing the edge of her belt knife on her thumb, and for once Elaine felt no objection. Van Deen asked to be left alone with her sister for a few moments and sat on the floor to cradle Adelius in her arms before they were out of the door. Jane, Van Deen's gnarled old warder, was waiting outside with a shivering Kirstian. Suddenly a wail burst out inside the hut, the full-throated cry of a woman mourning the loss of everything. Nynaeve, of all people, turned to go back, but Lan laid a hand on her arm, and Jaime planted himself before the door with eyes not much warmer than Lan's. There was nothing to do but leave them, Van Deen to shriek her pain, and Jaime to guard her in it. And share it, Elaine realized, feeling that knot of emotions in her head that was Birgitta. She shivered, and Birgitta put an arm around her shoulders. Avienda did the same from the other side, and motioned for Nynaeve to join them, which she did after a moment. The murder Elaine had thought of so lightly had come. One of their companions was a dark friend, and the day suddenly felt cold enough to shatter bones, but there was a warmth in the closeness of her friends. The last 10 funereal miles to Camelin took 2 days in the snow, with even the wind-finders decently subdued. Not that they pushed Marililla any less hard. Not that kin stopped talking and falling silent whenever a sister or one of the knitting circle came near. Vandine, with her sister's silver-mounted saddle on her horse, appeared as serene as she had at Adelius's graveside, but James' eyes carried a silent promise of death that surely rode in Vandine's heart, too. Elaine could not have been happier to see the walls and towers of Camelin if the very sight had given her the rose crown and brought back Adelius. Even Camelin, one of the great cities of the world, had never seen the likes of their party before, and once inside the 50-foot walls of gray stone, they attracted notice as they crossed the new city along wide, slush-filled streets, bustling with people and carts and wagons. Shopkeepers stood in their doorways and gaped. Wagon drivers reined in their teams to stare. Towering Aiel men and tall maidens eyed them from every corner, it seemed. The people seemed to take no notice of the Aiel, but Elaine did. She loved Avienda as she did herself, more, but she could not love an army of armed Aiel walking Camelin's streets. The inner city, ringed by towered walls of silver-streaked white, was a remembered delight, and Elaine finally began to feel that she was coming home. The streets followed the curves of the hills, and every rise presented a new vista of snow-covered parks and monuments laid out to be seen from above, as well as up close, of brightly tiled towers shining with 100 colors in the afternoon sun. And then the royal palace itself was before them, a confection of pale spires and golden domes and intricate stonework traceries. The banner of Andor waved from nearly every prominence, the white lion on red, and from the others, the dragon banner or the banner of light. At the tall gilded gates of the palace, Elaine rode forward alone in her travel-stained gray riding dress. Tradition and legend said women who first approached the palace in splendor always failed. She had made clear that she had to do it alone, yet she almost wished Avienda and Brigitte had succeeded in overruling her. Half the 24 guards in front of the gates were Aiel maidens, the others men in blue helmets and blue coats, with a red and gold dragon marching across the chest. "I am Elaine Trakand," she announced loudly, surprised at how calm she sounded. Her voice carried, and across the great plaza people turned from staring at her companions to stare at her. The ancient formula rolled from her tongue. "In the name of House Trakand, by right of descent from Ishara, I have come to claim the Lion Throne of Andor, if the light wills it so." The gates opened wide. It would not be that easy, of course. Even possession of the palace was not enough to hold the throne of Andor by itself. Passing her companions into the care of an astonished Reen Harfor, and very pleased to see that the graying first maid, round and as regal as any queen, still had the palace in her capable hands, and a coterie of servants in red and white livery, Elaine hurried to the grand hall, the throne room of Andor, alone again. This was not part of the ritual, not yet. She should have been going to change into the red silk with the pearl-worked bodice and white lions climbing the sleeves, but she felt compelled. This time not even Nynaeve tried to object. White columns 20 paces high marched down the sides of the grand hall. The throne room was empty still. That would not last long. Clear afternoon light through the glassed casements in tall windows along the walls mingled with the colored light through the great windows set in the ceiling, where the white lion of Andor alternated with scenes of Andoran victories and the faces of the land's earliest queens, beginning with Ishara herself, as dark as any of the Atha Anmier, as full of authority as any Aes Sedai. No ruler of Andor could forget herself with the predecessors who had forged this nation staring down at her. One thing she feared to see, the huge monstrosity of a throne, all gilded dragons, that she had seen standing on the dais at the far end of the hall in Tel Iran Riyadh. It was not there, thank the light. The lion throne no longer rested on a tall plinth like some trophy either, but kept its proper place upon the dais, a massive chair, carved and gilded, but sized for a woman. The white lion, picked out in moonstones on a field of rubies, would stand above the head of any woman who sat there. No man could feel at his ease sitting on that throne, because, so legend said, he would know he had sealed his doom. Elaine thought it more likely the builders had simply made sure a man would not fit on it easily. Climbing the white marble steps of the dais, she laid a hand on one arm of the throne. She had no right to sit on it herself. Not yet. Not until she was acknowledged queen. But taking oaths on the lion throne was a custom as old as Andor. She had to resist the desire to simply fall on her knees and weep into the throne's seat. Reconciled to her mother's death she might be, but this brought back all the pain. She could not break down now. Under the light, I will honor your memory, Mother, she said softly. I will honor the name of Morghese Trakand, and try to bring only honor to House Trakand. I ordered the guards to keep the curious and the favor-seekers away. I suspected you might want to be alone here for a time. Elaine turned slowly to face Dylan Taravin as the golden-haired woman walked the length of the grand hall. Dylan had been one of her mother's earliest supporters in her own quest for the throne. There was more gray in her hair than Elaine remembered, more lines at the corners of her eyes. She was still quite beautiful, a strong.
All right, everyone, I'm gonna call into the stream for tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by, and everyone continue to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.